Hello, everyone. This is your host, Philip Reiner. I wanted to welcome you to The Fourth Leg. This is a series of podcasts focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command and control, and its increasingly complicated future. Within this series, we're going to go straight to the experts across multiple sectors to talk about the modernization of nuclear command and control systems. Keep an eye on technology for global security in the coming weeks and months as we begin to launch additional podcast series focused on how to fix the internet, AI and global security, and other critical technology and security related issues. For now, we have so much to talk about. Let's get started. For today's podcast, we are joined by our colleague Peter Hayes from the Nautilus Institute. We spoke with Dr. Alex Wellerstein, who is a historian of science and a deep thinker on nuclear weapons, nuclear secrecy, and nuclear history more broadly. He speaks with us today about a specific subset of issues surrounding nuclear command, control, and communications, namely the actual command authority under which nuclear launch orders are given. Alex holds a PhD from Harvard and undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley, and currently conducts his research and teaches at the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey, just across the water there from Midtown Manhattan. Well, great to have you with us here, Alex. Thanks for joining the podcast. I think what would be really a great place to start is just to let the listeners know a little bit more about yourself, where you're coming from, the things that you research, the issues that you focus on, and how you found yourself kind of getting pulled into this world of nuclear command, control, and communications.
Well, I'm really happy to be on here. I'm a historian of science. I'm a historian of nuclear weapons. I have a book on the history of nuclear secrecy, which should be coming out in about a year.
Congratulations.
And oh yeah, it's been a little bit of time. And I'm just generally interested in nuclear things, to say the least, history, and now dabbling a little bit more into sort of policy related questions. This particular topic, a lot of my topics of interest come up because people ask about them. And when we were into the last election cycle, presidential election cycle, there was a lot of discussion about this question of who had their finger on the button, and is it true that the president could do this? And I heard that there was that they had to get permissions from somebody else, and all this kind of stuff going around. And I thought, well, this is an interesting topic, and people are asking me, not just on the internet, but people I work with, people in my family. And I thought, well, this is worth spending some time looking at it. And I had already been looking at sort of the early history of what we would now call command and control pretty closely in the World War II and immediate World War II period. And so expanding that outward and looking around and looking through sort of once secret documents and things. This is what I really enjoy doing. As after the results of the election, it went from being a kind of, oh, this is kind of an interesting topic that we ought to look into, and started feeling like, wow, we should really be taking this more serious as scholars.
Yeah.
You'll find discussions of it here and there, and there's occasional op-ed and all that kind of thing, but really proportional to the importance of the issue, I think it's been really under-considered and understudied. And even the scholars who I talk to about it tended to say things like, well, we don't really know what's going on there. There's too much secret, or it's probably not a big deal. I heard that it was this way. I read it on Wikipedia. And you realize, oh my gosh, this is a really important topic that, with a couple exceptions, some of the basic facts haven't even been sort of settled to everybody's happiness. So there's a lot of literature on command and control in general, but shockingly little on the question of how many people should be making the decision, how should the decision trees work, things like that. And so once I started picking at it, I thought, oh, this is both interesting as a historical development, which is, of course, my main area of expertise, but it also gets you into really, really meaty questions about the present day, about the future, and even sort of deeper questions about Well, in a democracy, how many people should make a decision of that magnitude? These are sort of political theory questions. So, anyway, that's my background.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what I'm about. That's why I came to this.
Well, and it's a fascinating piece too that I think was implicit to the discussions that we had back in January. And it's so everything that you were just describing, but in addition to that, having these sorts of discussions are what then drive force posture,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is what determines resource allocations. This is what countries literally build their entire systems around. And so, if you were in a scenario to perhaps have a shift away from a unitary decision making apparatus, you need to have an entirely different NC3 to incorporate the fact that you maybe need to have one, two, three different people who are in the decision chain who may be in different places, who still need to be able to communicate, et cetera, right? So,
You could, or
it's
you could just imagine there's ways to adapt. I could imagine adapting existing NC3 to something more, with a few more checks involved, that sort of thing. But yeah, but these things are all tied together. The stance, the force posture, the sort of underlying assumptions you're making about
yeah,
how these things ought to work in an ideal world versus what you're afraid of them doing in an unideal world. And it certainly is complicated. But again, my big message is always usually people bring up all the complications. They do it as a way of saying it's too complicated for us mere scholars who
mhm,
don't have clearances to talk about. And my argument is always, well, that's never stopped us before, Jesus, right? I mean, we talk about complicated stuff all the time and secret stuff all the time, but also that feels like and maybe this ties back into the secrecy. It feels almost like an abdication of responsibility, where this is an important thing. And now, aside from people talking about it, this has also become an issue with some of the Democratic primary candidates as well. So it's getting a little bit
mhm.
more. Hopefully, is almost to a level where this is everybody agrees. Hey, we should have some serious conversations about this and not just wave it away.
Sure. And well, and as someone who spent a number of years, almost a decade in the federal government, right, and deeply ensconced in classified uh, subject matter, I would often find myself having pushing myself to go out to those who were outside of government who were thinking about really hard problems in unclassified spaces because honestly they would have a different perspective and they'd be able to kind of help jar my thinking. So yeah, the notion that just because it's classified and just because it's sensitive means no one else should be talking about it is kind of ludicrous on its face. So the so the paper, right, the paper that you put together for the workshop back in January, I thought what would be good for those who perhaps maybe hadn't had the chance to read it yet, um and that's quite plausible, right? You very succinctly come to really one driving question. Um, and so if you could just elucidate what that driving question was of the paper and the research that you're doing around this, and then we can kind of go from there.
Sure. So the paper is an attempt to think in a very functional way about how nuclear use decisions are done in different countries. And by functional, I mean largely stripping out a lot of the individual distinctions between countries, which has its issues, right? I don't care if it's a Secretary of Defense. I don't care if it's a Minister of X. I want to know who can make an order to use nuclear weapons, and then is there anyone in that chain of command who is explicitly allowed or implicitly, expected to be able to say no? And if so, who is that? And then at
Hmm.
what point does it get beyond the decision makers? At what point does it end up in the hands of people who aren't going to question the order? Because we can assume I have a series of little diagrams which help me think through
Yep.
these kinds of things because I'm very visual in this sense, where you have sort of the soldier with the bomb at the sort of end of the
Yeah.
chain, right? And you can imagine this is a person in a silo or a person in a submarine, and the odds that this person is not going to follow a valid order that comes is really low. They've been screened for it. They've been trained trained to do it. If you talk to these people, they say, "Of course, we push the button." They're also usually like 19, right? I mean, they're not in a place to sort of sit back and say, "Well, world affairs are this way, and I know that the actions would be kept." That isn't what you don't get the job if you're that kind of person, right? So we assume they're not going to say no. We assume that there's a lot of people in that chain of communication, all of these complicated signals and agencies and things. They're probably not going to say no or even be in a position to say no to the whole thing. And so that ends up reducing your sort of functional chain of command to a handful of people in some cases, usually a head of state, maybe at sometimes a head of the military or secretary of defense, and then usually some top level military officer who turns that political order into essentially into a military order. And so the paper is attempting to say, a, what is the situation? How
Yep.
do various countries use it, including the United States? What do we know? What don't we know? What are the bounds of our uncertainty? And then also, is this system that we apparently have, this unitary system, which several countries have, but the United States notably has, where a single person, the president of the United States, can issue the order, and there really isn't anyone in that chain who, except for some very specific circumstances, appears to be empowered to say no. Is that the best of all possible worlds? And so the paper explores a little bit what some of the issues are, right? So the obvious one that comes up is, if you have to take a vote from Congress before nuclear weapons can be used, that's going to take too long and the Russians are going to nuke us and we'll never reply. Okay, fair, right?
Right.
So if you add additional complexity, do you reduce the deterrent credibility? That's a real question, but we can talk about that. And then also a lot of questions, a lot of the paper is about trying to convince other scholars that, this is something you can take seriously, even if we don't know all the facts, even if we don't know exactly how these NC3 systems work in all these countries. We seem to have enough available information to come to sort of, again, broad functional descriptions and start asking, do we want 2 people, 3 people, no people, 1 person, hook it up to a computer, whatever option you might think is a good one. I don't in the paper necessarily advocate one of these as being the end all of all of them, but I do think that the current situation, which is designed almost, basically exclusively with the idea of rapid retaliation in mind, introduces new problems that maybe there are other ways to fix without losing the rapid retaliation. So that's the long version of the paper, but there you go.
Yeah, the long version of the question, which really, I mean, it cuts to something that's incredible. And you alluded to this, for at least briefly earlier. It cuts really to the current reality in which we find ourselves, where a lot of these long-standing assumptions are starting to be called into question. And it really, and I thought you did a deft job of addressing this in the workshop and in the paper. It's really not so much about singular individuals per se, right? We've got some examples that may be driving some of the discussion, but really, at the core of it, is that really the most reliable and necessary system in today's reality, right? So, um, in terms of the U.S. system, you just started to describe it from the research that you've done, then, and we talked about this a little bit earlier this week, right, between Peter and yourself. So there's been kind of a lot of back and forth in terms of this debate of what actually is the existing scenario in the United States, and not to beat what may be a dead horse, but Alex, from where you sit and everything that you see, what is your take on what that actually is?
Sure. So the way a lot of people think it works is like this: the president essentially gives an order to use nuclear weapons, and he can do this a variety of ways. If he's in the White House or the Pentagon, that's sort of a pick up the phone sort of the deal. If he's out somewhere else, he's got the guy with the football, the emergency satchel that has war plans and communication equipment and things like that. But either way, the president transmits an order. The way people think it works is that the Secretary of Defense then takes that order and then conveys it on to the military, right? So you have the Secretary of Defense as a sort of intermediary. And so a lot of the discussions, including ones that I had early on in this, were about, well, could the Secretary of Defense say no? It's not explicitly
Right.
authorized to say no. There's nothing in the system that would imply the Secretary of Defense could say no, but could they just de facto say no, or just refuse to pass on the order, right? And so there's a lot of discussions that people have, again, including myself, over, well, what would happen if the SecDef didn't do it? Would the president fire them? Would you then go to the deputy SecDef? How could you go all the way down the line? At this point, has somebody tackled the president? Whatever, right? As far as I can tell, all of that is the wrong conversation to be having. The Secretary of Defense isn't an important part of that chain. They're totally advisory, as former Secretary of Defense William Perry put it to me. It's an
Yeah.
advisory position. they are supposed to, the president should, and this is the language, it's this sort of normative should, right? Ought to, should consult with all of their advisors, including the SecDef, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the whole list of people who are supposed to be in on this phone call before making this decision. But it's ultimately the president's decision, not the Secretary of Defense's. There's no room for a veto by the Secretary of Defense. And again, if the Secretary of Defense is not available or the president chooses not to consult them, there doesn't seem to be anything that requires them to be consulting. It's an ought, not a must, which is a big deal. And I will say that Bruce Blair at Princeton correctly got on my case because he had been saying that the SecDef was not important for a long time. But it took me talking to a SecDef and then finding documentation that seemed to support this in the form of Air Force doctrine, which makes it very clear that the order goes directly from the president to the military. It's a smooth jump between the civilian and military aspects of this. That actually totally convinced me of this. So I've gone back and tried to correct everything in which I was wrong. But this is the big misconception, right? And so that particular blog post has the same misconception. Where does this misconception come from? It seems to come mostly from a funny linguistic confusion, which you'd think would not be the origin of a massive misconception. But a lot of the old doctrine from the 1970s and 80s that describes the system refers to the order as coming from the NCA, which is usually the National Command Authorities, which is usually the President and the Secretary of Defense. The official chain of command, as laid out for normal kinds of orders, does go from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the military. So it's not like totally silly made up. However, in the nuclear area, there seems to be a difference in there, and everything I've found that is reputable seems to go along with that. And indeed, all of this literature now, when it talks about all this doctrine, it no longer uses NCA acronym. It's confusing. It says very specifically the president. And so I'm fairly convinced there's always going to be someone out there who says, well, I saw this on Wikipedia, and okay, that's fine. One of the things I'm trying to do is document, and we should have a website up by the end of the month, hopefully, end of August, at presidentandthebomb.com for all your President and the Bomb needs. Which is basically taking every little data point that we can find in terms of interviews, in terms of documentation, in terms of doctrine, whatever, declassified things, and putting them in one place so that you don't have to take my word for it. It's sort of a performative evidence, which I think as a historian of a secretive topic is important. If I want you to actually believe this is a problem, you have to agree with me that it actually is unitary control and there isn't a check. And so showing you that that's the case is actually not that hard. You can document exactly when and why the U.S. adopted this policy. So anyway, that's the what people think is the case. The reality is that the president can do it. There's multiple ways, from what I can tell, that the president could initiate this order. But basically, the president has to get a valid order to the head of the military. It could be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or their office, most likely, or it could be the commander of Strategic Command. Both of these have been listed in doctrine and various other things as pathways to initiating a nuclear strike order. And these are both military people. They are not meant to say no. There is no provision. The only clear place where they have an authorization to disobey an order is if they think that it is against the laws of war. And they have said in congressional hearing that if they got an order that was sort of blatantly disregarding of the laws of war, go nuke that orphanage or something like that, that they would push back on it and that they would take context into consideration, et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. That does not nearly cover the spectrum of possibilities, especially since every U.S. nuclear war plan has been vetted by lawyers as not violating the laws of war. So the paper goes into all of this kind of details in there, but basically there isn't any sort of significant check. That's the sort of conclusion I've come to.
I'd be interested at that point, with the U.S. characterization in mind, to think a little bit about how it compares and contrasts with the other 8 nuclear weapon states, right? And really what I was curious about was, as you thought about the U.S. example and you began to look at other countries and how they approach this, how it may have helped you think about what sorts of I don't know, alternative solutions there might be out there. But just if we could briefly, obviously you do this lay down in the paper. What was your kind of conclusions when it comes to how the other 8 nuclear weapon states approach this?
So it's pretty interesting. There
Yeah.
are a few who basically do it like we do, which is not unexpected. Again, there's a justification for having it be one decision maker. There's also the fact that in the US case as well, the decision makers often hoard that power. That's not something they want to delegate. And just to back up 1 second on there, the reason we have this in the US initially is not for the retaliatory reason. That's the later late Cold War, missiles exist justification for it. You don't get that. There's no way the Soviet Union is going to knock us out without us being able to knock them back until pretty late in the Cold War. The reason the US sets up this system initially in the 40s is because that Truman fears that the military, if you give them access to
Yep.
nuclear weapons, will use the nuclear weapons and they're not trustworthy. The president in this scenario is the balance. And so that's why it gets a little bit tricky talking about today when people are worried that maybe the president isn't the balance, right? The military is not set up to be the balance against the president. It's totally meant originally to be the other way around. Anyway, you can extrapolate for other countries as well. Not all of them are super eager to have many extra people in the command chain, not just for speed reasons, but because let's say you run a country, you want to be able
Yep.
to have that power as exclusively yours. So there are a few countries that are like that. What's more interesting to me is that there are countries that are not like that, from what we can tell. And again, lots of evidentiary caveats here. The US program is hard to get information of, and the US is relatively transparent compared to most countries about how its nuclear weapon systems work. It's
Sure.
way better than, say, Israel, who doesn't admit they have nuclear weapons, right? So there's a lot of unknowns here. And this is reliant largely on the work of other scholars. So thank you, other scholars. I cite you in the paper. But the most interesting cases for me, it appears that Russia does not do it this way.
Yep.
Russia appears to have a system where there are 3 people who can initiate an order, which is interesting. There aren't that many systems out there that I've seen where more than one person could say we should use nukes. The president is not the head of state is not the only person in this situation, but it takes 2 of these people agreeing for the order actually to be valid. And that's interesting, right? So you're in some way spreading the use power around a little bit, but also constraining it a little bit. And you can make an argument for why they might want this. It makes it potentially less likely that one person can make a really terrible decision. Maybe they do it because it's redundant in some way. I don't know. Maybe it collapses in emergency situations down to one person making a decision. In Soviet times, it seemed to work something like that. You would have the Politburo would basically give the authority to use nuclear weapons to a top military commander, and then it would be their decision to make. So that's another way to think about transferring authority, the sort of authorization approach.
Yeah. Did the discussions around the Russia country profile back in January have any? Did it confirm some of what your understanding of the Russian decision structure looks like, or did it muddle it even further? Did you take anything away from that presentation that helped?
It didn't touch on this particular question. It touched on
Right.
many other really useful questions, and it did help me understand the sort of broader Russian NC3 stuff. But this particular question is sort of like not part of the conversation, which was interesting
Gotcha.
by itself,
Yep.
right? So that to me, the most useful thing about that from the Russian perspective is you can imagine going to somebody and saying, "Hey, did you know France does it in this complicated way and has a check? They seem to have a check too. Somebody who has to agree with it and can say no."
Yeah.
And people can say, "Well, whatever. France has 200 nuclear weapons. Who cares, right? Or whatever it is, right? Like France is a minor nuclear power. The United States has got thousands of weapons, and it has them because this other party, Russia, has thousands of weapons, and we can't play by your, French idealistic games. Fine. But when the other person in this dynamic has a system that doesn't rely on unitary control, then you start to say, well, hell, if they can live with it, why can't we live with it, right? Why can't we set
Hmm.
up a system? Surely the Russians aren't fools about this. If anything, they've often been more vulnerable than we are to these kinds of things. And so, you'd think that the other system that I found really useful and this was the meeting was extremely helpful in clarifying my understanding of this, was the British system. The
Yeah.
British do have a unitary control system. The prime minister has that control, and no one else, right? And that's That's a lot of power concentrated in one place. But
Yep.
that's very deliberate in the UK system. And they, again, see that as being the prime minister and not the military have the discretion. That really sharpened my view of the military civilian split on this. The British think that it's a great thing that they put it in the hands of the prime minister,
Yep.
because that means that no general is going to either go off half cocked in any way, or you're not going to have a situation where the prime minister orders it and the general is going to disobey. And they think this is a purely political decision. It's a purely civilian decision. Nuclear weapons are not military weapons in this framework, political theory framework. They are weapons of state. And so you need the representative of the state making the decision. And we can say to one another, well, I'm not totally sure if I love the idea of the prime minister having that power or being the
Yeah.
representative of the state, or whatever your political preferences may be at any given moment, right? Whoever happens to be prime minister over there. But I like that they have clarified that that is exactly the theory behind it. And it leads me to think about the US case where people are saying, I really hope the military will push back
Yeah.
in some way. And it leads me to say things like, no, you actually don't want that. You don't want generals making this decision. The UK is totally right that this is a political decision. The question is, who is the representative of the political state that you want to do this? Is it one person? Is it a bunch of people? That aspect of it is fine. So anyway, that really helped me think about drawing that line. When does that order jump from the civilian political state to the
Yeah.
military state, which isn't always a fine line in every country, right? But in the US, it definitely is, right?
It's a conversation we were actually lucky to just have with that Reiner McGower.
Mm-hmm.
We just recorded a podcast with that we'll be releasing with him here in the next couple of weeks, and we talked a little bit about this. And Peter, if Peter you want to jump in here, but Peter was able to push with John on the question precisely around what you were just describing, how the UK has come to this over the course of its history as it's come to just the one nuclear weapons system, to have just the prime minister. And I think it's in some of the language that they shall consult with a small group of advisors, but that, yeah, the military is kept at arm's length, except for essentially technical
Mm-hmm.
advisory type things, right? And the question back to Admiral Gower was, well, there's numerous instances in the relative recent past in the United States where the military or even Pentagon senior leadership has been kind of the moderating voice, where the military is the one who's had to live through years and years of dismembered bodies and PTSD and destroyed cities, and they're the ones that say, well, look, actually, you know what, you may want to think twice before you go down that path. And it was a question of how has that changed over time? Where's the adjustment? You have new personalities who may come into the prime minister's role. Look at the current situation. I mean, think about
Mm-hmm.
the cover of the most recent Economist, right? There's a sense that we don't really know where even this prime minister could take things, and yet that prime minister is the sole representative who writes the instructions that go out to those submarine commanders, and that will be in their hands if and when something goes sideways. Peter, do you recall how Admiral Gower actually responded to that
Yes,
one?
well, I mean, he said a number of things. First of all, he said the militaries still do have a say. He said that they basically have their say by advising, reporting to, and essentially, if they have strong political motivations, I don't mean political in a partisan sense, but a strong view on what the decision should be, they push that upwards through the civilian layers of advisors to the prime minister. So they can still expect to have their voice heard at the table, separate to that of the senior military advisor who's giving direct technical advice to the prime minister. The other point he made was that this was not always the case, and that over time, as they simplified the force structure, so they no longer had bombers, which the military may have to be much more involved in decision making because of the speed at which real time decisions have to be made while they're in the air, as against submarines, much slower dynamics in some respects. Uh, once you simplify the force structure and reduce it down to one nuclear force delivery system, then that makes it kind of easier, in a sense, for the civilians to have the ultimate say, with the military input, held at arm's length. That was what I understood the essence of what he said. So the question that I want to throw at you is, this very difficult question of what kind of information do the top level commanders owe it to the people who will actually fire and deliver the nuclear weapons, uh, in terms of the targets, the necessity of attacking those targets with nuclear weapons, whether the use would be proportional to the damage, and whether you could really separate the military targets from the civilian targets. What kind of responsibility do our military, both the civilian and the military, in the nuclear weapons enterprise, really carry, and can they actually use that um, uh, tremendous burden to effect in the real world, or is this just an epiphenomenal, non-significant issue? It bears heavily on the accountability question of who's really accountable in the nuclear command structure.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of side with Herring on this, of all people, who I've talked to a little bit. What he was asking for is, if he was in the bunker silo, that he would be getting some very complicated readout of why the weapon was being used. The lawyers thought it was harmonious with international law, and all of these things that are important for him to have his conscience feel good about it. But he recognized that he's a 20-something-year-old person sitting in a bunker in the middle of the Midwest or something. He doesn't have time to understand all that, process it. He may not have the relevant expertise. He may not understand the context. The answer may not be there are missiles incoming, but even that might be a lot to process very quickly. There may be reasons not to tell him, things like that. What he wanted was an assurance that there was a system in place that would guarantee that any order that ended up in his silo was legal and was at some level moral and was at some level the product of rational thinking, right? We could call it sanity if we want, or just say that this is not some out of the blue kind of bad idea. And he thought it was not too much to ask that, just to say, so essentially, so there's a system in place, right? That'll make sure that all of these criteria, these very basic criteria, are in place. And they found the asking to be indicative, and the fact that he kept asking, he didn't just shut up and never ask again. But they found the asking to be indicative of him being a poor candidate for that job, because they wanted somebody who will just do the order blindly. And they also, because the answer was no, right? The answer was there isn't a system in place for that. The system has some of those qualities in principle, right? So if it's an authenticated strike order, then the lawyers have already approved it for international law, So what Harold is really asking is there a system in place that will guarantee all of those? And the answer is no. And also the fact that he was asking meant that they decided he was not a good candidate for somebody in a role who they thought was very important, followed orders, because especially in those days, they did worry about a retaliatory strike. I think what we want is not something that necessarily everybody in the bunkers would be happy with. Obviously, you don't want anybody in the bunkers not happy with this. I also don't want to get to the earlier discussion about the military and civilians. I don't want to make a presumption based on like current military culture or something like that. That's, I think, where some of this goes awry. I think actually present military culture in the United States with regard to nuclear weapons is very averse to using them, which is great. But that's the product of decades and decades of them internalizing the idea that they aren't usable military weapons and they're not tactical sort of decisions, that they are sort of large scale political decisions that the military doesn't want part of. That stuff can change. That can change in a generation, right? what you want is a system where you think all of these things could be figured out, and so that somebody in that position of using them would feel like, well, if I'm getting this at this point, I feel confident that this is real and this isn't spoofed, and that the person issuing it, this has been vetted, and this is really the best choice, and I should just carry it out. And that way you get the credibility of any kind of deterrent value you might want, and you don't sort of bog the system down. So for me, all of the work of like, what do you of making that decision making, that should take place at the top of the hierarchy. The question is how many people should be at the top of the hierarchy, and who should be there, and how should that work, and what happens if somebody disagrees, that kind of thing. But these are good. These are heavy questions. At some level, all of these questions get back to the sort of paradoxical aspect of nuclear weapons, where on the one hand they are supposed to be this very vital and important, and something that a lot of people think is necessary. On the other hand, they kind of are inconsistent with values about mass slaughter and things of that nature. And there isn't any great way to square that other than to say, well, if they have to exist, or we agree as a country or a world or whatever that they have to exist, then let's at least make it so that the possibility of their use is made very difficult. And certainly let's make it so that either accident or, God forbid, getting up on the wrong side of the bed or something like that, let's make sure that they're not used stupidly. Because there's something even worse than dying in a nuclear holocaust would be dying in a stupid nuclear holocaust.
Well, he actually never, to my knowledge, never actually got an answer to his question from the Air Force. And I'm not sure that there was an answer. I mean, whatever system they had to review the nuclear strike plans at the time. So, Alex, to my knowledge, he never actually got an answer from the Air Force. They basically said, wrong question. And he kept on asking the question. They kept on saying, wrong question. And then they just cashiered him to make an example of it, which was something that the then Air Force General Doherty, who was in charge, explicitly spelled out. I think it was in 1987,
Mm-hmm.
the reason that he was run out of the Air Force. So I'm not making that up myself. That actually was the Air Force's view. There may have been a very good reason that he never got an answer, which is that, in fact, it's not possible in the time available for any decision maker to really resolve the uncertainties and simultaneously solve. I think John Harvey's table presented at the conference was something like 15 or 20 different questions that you need answers to make a rational decision in the time available, which varies from no time, zero, because you've already been hit with a nuclear weapon, in many scenarios out to maybe 30, 40 minutes, maybe a couple of hours. But even in a couple of hours, you won't have much of the data needed to make a rational decision. So in that sense, it may be that he was asking an impossible question because there is no rational answer.
You could imagine answers that are never going to be totally satisfactory, but get closer to it, right? You could imagine one that says, look, none of these use scenarios are unconsidered already, right? So in the current U.S. system, as much as anyone understands it, there's sort of a menu of options, right, for all sorts of different types of scenarios. Are we talking about we're only going to try to hit a couple of their missile bases, or are we going to destroy their industrial facilities or whatever, right? In all of these scenarios, you can have pre-run by legal people who say, according to our interpretation of the law, which is pretty, expansive, but these satisfy the Geneva Conventions as much as any nuclear strike can satisfy them, right? You can also imagine saying, well, we have a situation. In my idea, the best kind of command structure would be one in which anyone at the bottom would say, there have been several people in this line who have all agreed and all had the ability to say no, that this is the best possible choice that could be made. If I have gotten it, then I mean, these people may not know the answer, God forbid, right? They're going to have impartial knowledge, and they're going to have bad assumptions, and who knows, right? Bad judgment, whatever, because they're humans, right? But at some level, they're willing to put their name down to this thing, and thus the person in the booth can sort of absolve themselves of the personal responsibility. Will that work for every person in the booth? No, but if you're not willing to give away a little bit of your responsibility as structure, then you probably shouldn't like work in a silo, right? Um, to me, that's better than the current system, which is, you have no reassurances whatsoever. All you know is that the military agreed to pass it on. Maybe they did that because they agreed with their lawyers agreed that this technically satisfied international law according to current interpretation of it. But you have no idea whether they think it's a good idea, and you have no idea whether anyone else in the cabinet strenuously objected or anything like that. To me, that's the much more uncertain problem.
Well, I think that some of the defenders of the current system will argue that, in fact, there is no rational way to know what will happen if a nuclear weapon is used in almost any scenario. And so it's all bets are off once you fall off that cliff and deterrence fails. But the essence of deterrence rests precisely on the uncertainty and as to the outcomes. And therefore, like Alice, you go down the rabbit hole, as some have put it, and you try and figure out where you are in the rabbit hole, navigating with the metaphysics of nuclear war. And if indeed deterrence fails, well, these issues are second order questions, if you like. Personally, I think that's a fairly irresponsible position because it rests on an assumption that the risks are worth taking, or that humans are perfect and would never make decisions that would lead deterrence to fail. And the costs being potentially infinite would suggest that that's a irresponsible strategy to hang your hat on.
At some level, at that, you might as well justify it by rolling a dice, then, right? I mean, we do believe human judgment plays a role in these things. For many of these states, I would just point out, especially the United States, it's not just deterrent scenarios. I mean, we do not have a retaliatory only policy. So I worry less about the U.S. retaliating if Russia decides to nuke us, we're probably going to retaliate. I mean, that seems fairly on the table, and hopefully that keeps them from doing it, right? I worry more about the oh, let's use a low yield bunker buster in Iran to knock out some, underground facility. I'm sure that won't escalate to a terrible idea, right? I worry more about that kind of scenarios that are on the line where this is to get back to this other issue that comes up. I'm not so much worried about the president getting up one day or prime minister and saying, nuke them all to hell. I mean, I'm pretty sure the military would say, I don't think so, right? Like they have enough judgment in that respect. But I do worry about, oh, things are tense in eastern Ukraine. Maybe we should use one of these low yield weapons to show them who's boss. I'm worried about things that are going to be harder for the military to push back upon because they're not necessarily obviously crazy. And in fact, we have a lot of doctrine that's built up that says they're not a bad idea. And if that is in the mouth or the head of state, that's going to be a very hard thing for anybody to go against. And so if you had somebody else in there who was allowed to go against, they could say, that's a terrible idea. Why don't we just use conventional weapons? And I'm just not going to approve that. You could actually head off even that kind of thing, much less a deterrent situation.
I mean, yes, they're exactly the kinds of debates that might ensue from one of these limited nuclear war trigger scenarios. The other obvious one that I think grips a lot of people these days is if North Korea were to use one nuclear weapon and we were to respond or think about responding, we're almost automatically involving China and Russia in a form of stare down. They may just say, okay, this is your problem, you deal with it, including whatever radiating, smoking ruins are left if you proceed. But they might also get involved themselves, and that might spill over into the Taiwan Straits. So you've got then a US-China dynamic at play, and things could go badly wrong in Russian-Chinese relations in the future in the next 10 years. And so you're now talking about multiple nuclear weapon states aiming at each other at the same time. It's not as simple as it used to be, and that also makes it much harder for decision makers to know what it is that they're doing and to control the results, to control the dynamics that then follow from that complexity. Because you just can't anticipate, all the combinations and events that will then occur. But I want to ask another sort of fundamental question that was asked during the Second Cold War quite a lot, but hasn't come up recently much. When we think about nuclear commanders and control systems, commanders both civilian and military are human beings. And today, I have to say, we have General Hyten, the current nuclear commander, accused of sexual harassment. And we're seeing an orthogonal collision of the Me Too politics with nuclear command and control communication politics in the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing just concluded. How do you view this emotional, sexually freighted aspect of human decision making when it comes to nuclear command, Alex? I mean, we can't deny that this is an aspect of the decision making. It's not just rational cognitive activity, is it?
I mean, the tricky thing about any kind of nuclear wargaming or theories or any of that is ultimately they're trying to derive sort of large scale human behavior and make sense of what would happen. But you're talking about systems that have really small numbers of people who matter. You're talking about individuals who are very hard to predict. And I don't know if nuclear is uniquely, say, sexualized or fraught. I think some of these issues, from what I've read, are issues with force structure in the military, American military in general. Some of these may just be the problem with having men in charge of everything. But certainly when you combine human fallibility with existential risk, you've made a pretty potent heavy brew, right? I mean, it's not a good thing. I think that the solution to this is, of course, not to imagine that you're somehow going to make sure that it's only good people in there, or even imagine that if you say got rid of all the men, it would all be better. It might be, but women can do terrible things too. That's just the way it is with people. We're not the most straightforward species, but to design systems that have that built into it. At most levels, the American system actually does have that built into it, right? This is why we have two-man rule, right? Pakistan apparently has a three-man rule at times, right? Which is a sign that you don't necessarily trust every single person in your system, which is good. That's not an insult, right? But you recognize individuals are fallible, screening systems are fallible. Let's make it so two people have to be part of any interaction with a nuclear weapon because one of them might go down the wrong path or make some terrible decision or something like that. And I think that's good. You might ask if two is enough, if three is enough, right? We're talking about something where the consequences of error are extraordinary, much higher than with conventional weapons. One guy takes a tank out for a drunken spin is a problem. One guy, starts playing with the nuclear submarine, it's a catastrophe, right? There's differences there. But at the same time, it's better than certainly trusting that individual humans are totally reliable. And it's also probably better, and this is the other flip direction this comes at sometimes, is maybe we should put computers in charge of it. Well, we know computers aren't super reliable either and have lots of errors. So, you don't want to trust any of these things 100%. And this again gets back to the sort of ultimate decision-making thing. We do that at every stage in the chain except the ultimate one, which is whether to use the weapons. We don't have a two-man rule at that level. And I think human beings are totally fallible. I think even one who is not fallible can become fallible. We've seen presidents, we've seen people of influence, we've seen people with great talent and intelligence succumb to all sorts of vices, whether they're drinking too heavily or painkillers or whatever, or their sexual addictions or their risk-taking activity or just dementia or Alzheimer's or mental illness or tumors in the wrong place in your brain. There's a million ways somebody can go wrong. And knowing that, the answer is don't put individual people in charge of gigantic critical existential systems, right? Have multiple people be on there because the odds of two people having that exact same thing hopefully is lower. You can imagine situations where it's not the case, but certainly it's better than one. And that in the end is kind of what I am trying to come to in the paper. I find that if you talk to the people who support these kinds of unitary systems, they are willing to disregard that risk more than they're willing to at the expense of their fear of some sort of massive retaliatory strike that will take 3 seconds to respond. I think that in our present state of the world, the odds of a massive incoming strike from anybody that actually requires that 1 minute of response time or something is a lot lower than the chance of somebody you might elect might make a really terrible decision for some reason. And that's not about the current holder of any offices. That's about the current state of sort of global politics.
And I think that might be a good perhaps final tangent to go down or road to go down, if you will, before we wrap up, which is in the paper you actually asked the rhetorical question of which of these approaches, if any, actually points to a way forward. Maybe this is part of what you're going to be putting up on the new website that you were alluding to earlier, but just curious as to, now having done all of this research analysis and thinking around how each of the 9 nuclear weapon states consider this, what's kind of your sense of things at this point? What could be potentially, and as we started the conversation, thinking about these are policy decisions that get made well in advance of the deployment of capital, the allocation of resources, and what have you, against what sorts of structures are actually going to be in place. And so just curious, and so that happens way back in the thought process, and where we find ourselves right now. And as you heard in January, the United States in particular is really at a critical juncture in its thought process as to how to develop an NC3 system for the 21st century. And it's an opportunity, perhaps to a certain extent, to actually inject novel thinking, however reticent some in the system may be to hear it, right? But to inject some novel thinking or approaches as to how the structure might be made more resilient to these sorts of human attributes, if you will. So just curious, from your kind of broad takeaways from looking at all these different approaches, what your sense is in terms of what situations might be better or than what we have now.
So there's so the paper talks about some of the different approaches that people have proposed, and some of them are very drastic, right? Change the
Yeah.
whole force structure so that we don't have launch on alert problems, right? So get rid of ICBMs, have
Right.
only submarines, and then you can take as much time as you want, and you can deliberate. Okay, that's a big change, right? You have some which are sort of little, in theory, changes, like let's announce that we have a no first use policy, and that does some of the work, but not all of the work. And it's also not clear that that would be married to the force structure and anybody take it seriously and things like that. But that's a possibility. For me, the idea I keep coming back to, the answer that both feels appealing to me in that it doesn't solve all the problems, but it would be better than the status quo, and it would be relatively easy to put in place. It doesn't require you reimagining all of nuclear strategy, and also is, I think, politically mostly appealing in the sense that it doesn't meet immediate. You're not going to have so many entrenched people saying, no, no, I love the current system. That why would you change it? To me, the simplest fix, which would not get us out of the nuclear dilemma, because you're not going to get out of that with any kind of simple policy fix, right? For me, the simplest fix is make it the system more or less that people think it is, right? So make it so that the president's order has to be approved by the Secretary of Defense, and change it just a little bit. Just give the Secretary of Defense the ability to say no. That's it. Simple little thing. It takes what people already think is the case, which I think makes it an appealing sell, right? What if it was actually what you thought it was? How hard, people have already accepted that as a possibility. And then you make it just a little bit stronger. You give the SecDef just a little bit more power. How do you exactly do this? I don't know. But you could do it by saying something like, pass a law that says no nuclear use order can be valid unless the Secretary of Defense agrees with the president that it's a good idea, or something like this, right? You could imagine something that would put the onus on the military and give them an ability to refuse it if the Secretary of Defense hadn't approved it, or something like this. You could imagine practical ways of doing it. And then in a situation of where really everybody agreed there was no time and nobody could find the Secretary of Defense or whatever, you could give the military the ability to revert to unitary command, if they were willing to testify that they truly believe that they needed the response faster than it could get on the line. And that, to me, that kind of system would satisfy all of the immediate objections to any kind of changes, and also would add that one extra layer of people being able to say no into a system, but do it in a way that doesn't involve some sort of complicated. I think any system where the answer is, well, we have to get a bunch of members of the House and Congress together, and we have to. I don't think any
Yeah.
of that's going to fly. The House and Congress would still get a say indirectly in this because they have to approve the Secretary of Defense, and this would be something they would grill them on. What kinds of situations would you say no, whatever, right? And that would
Yep.
allow you to reintroduce a little bit. Would it fix all of the problems? No, not in the slightest. But it would be a lot less dangerous than what we currently have, and actually strikes me as something that you could imagine being like feasible, maybe not this administration, but a future one. You could actually imagine Congress deciding, hey, that's a little bit of us reclaiming power. We had a little bit of catch in the system. Could the Secretary of Defense be a hand-chosen person who totally rolls over? Of course, but you're still requiring one other human being to sign their name to this thing. And I think that would make me feel better. It's not going to satisfy everybody. But that's ultimately the conclusion I came to. If you want to replace the Secretary of Defense with somebody else, fine. You can have that conversation, right? Who ought to it be,
Yeah,
et cetera,
yeah.
et cetera. But I'm sort of in favor of keeping it almost as equally simple as the unitary system, with just enough check in there to make this sort of problem seem less likely. It's not going to prevent the use of nuclear weapons, but nothing is if you're going to have them.
So you don't think it's a good idea to just let the computers make the decision?
I trust computers about as much as I trust individuals. No, I mean, the thing is, and this comes up in the automated car discussions a lot, right? A computer in most situations doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be as good as people are. But in nuclear situations, I still feel like that's a high bar.
Yeah, I think one of the problems when it comes to computers is they're built by people, and they're a poor representation of what is already a flawed system of decision making, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anybody. Well, I shouldn't say anybody. I think maybe all indications, at least that we're gleaning, are that both the Russians and the Chinese are more actively contemplating turning some of these decisions over to decision support systems than I think the United States or the UK or others might be. But it kind of remains to be seen where that actually ends up. I think it's a more realistic and plausible scenario today than probably it ever has been.
Sure.
I just want to say thank you, Alex. This is a fascinating conversation. I think we could just keep talking and talking and talking about this, and we will. But for now, just want to say thank you again for joining us here today and being a part of the podcast.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here. This is a fun conversation. And yes, I could talk for ages about this. It's totally fascinating. And again, we will have a website with a lot of these things on it up, hopefully by the end of August.
End of August. That's fantastic. Thanks again, Alex. Really appreciate this. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun.
Thanks, Alex.
All right, to all of our listeners, then be sure to keep an eye out for Alex's website, and we'll flag it on our website once it's up and going. As always, for everybody, thanks again for listening and for joining us here today. We'll be back next week with another episode of The Fourth Leg, where we will actually be playing that conversation that we referenced earlier here today with Alex, speaking with Rear Admiral John Gower from the UK about the very unique NC3 approach that the British take. Be sure to check it out. Until then, we'll see you on Twitter, online, or let us know what your thoughts are. Thanks in advance.